It was 6:40 in the morning when Danny Ray Colston found something in the mud that made him stop breathing for a second. He'd been hunting this ridge in Daniel Boone National Forest for 11 years. He knew every deer trail, every creek crossing, every place the light hit first when the sun came up over the hollow. He knew what a bear track looked like. He knew what a bobcat left behind, and what a big whitetail buck pressed into soft ground after a night of rain. He knew this land the way some people know the inside of their own house, without needing to look twice to find their way through it in the dark. He did not know what this was. The print was sunk almost 2 inches into the mud along the creek bank, heel to toe, and when Danny Ray laid his own boot down next to it, a size 11, he'd tell people later, like the size mattered, like it would make what he was looking at any easier to explain. His boot didn't even reach the arch. He said later that the first thing he felt wasn't fear. It was disbelief. He crouched down in the cold and just stared at it, running his fingers along the edge, expecting it to smear apart the way mud does, expecting his brain to catch up and tell him it was a trick of the light. An old boot print stretched by erosion. Anything with a name he already knew. It didn't smear. It didn't have a name he already knew. And 40 yards downstream, in a second patch of soft ground near a fallen tree, there was another one. This is the story of what Danny Ray Colston found on that ridge in eastern Kentucky, and the plaster cast that, for a few days, was the only physical proof any of it had happened at all. Before we get to what happened to that cast, you need to understand exactly what he found, and why the men who eventually looked at it couldn't quite explain it away. Danny Ray was 43 years old, a maintenance supervisor at a plant in London, Kentucky, and by every account from people who knew him, not the kind of man given to exaggeration. He'd hunted that section of National Forest since he was a teenager, taught by his father, who had hunted it before him. This wasn't a weekend hobbyist wandering off a marked trail with a phone camera looking for attention. This was a man on land he considered, in a very real sense, his own backyard, land his family had walked for 2 generations before his boots ever touched it. Those who knew him described a careful, methodical person. He kept a hunting log going back over a decade, tracking weather conditions, deer movement patterns, even the specific trees he'd seen bucks rub their antlers against season after season. He wasn't the kind of man who called the newspaper over a raccoon in his attic. When people who'd known him for 20 years were later asked whether they thought Danny Ray was lying, or exaggerating, or looking for attention, the answer was almost universally the same. That's just not who he is. He was out that morning archery hunting, alone, set up near a game trail he'd used for years, when he heard something moving through the brush on the far side of the creek, heavy, deliberate, not the light quick movement of a deer. He said it sounded like something walking upright, a 2-count rhythm instead of the 4-beat pattern he was used to hearing from a buck working through dry leaves. He described it later as sounding almost like someone in heavy boots trying, and failing, to move quietly through underbrush, a controlled heaviness, not the panicked crash of a startled animal. He didn't see anything by the time he worked up the nerve to cross the creek and look. Whatever it was had gone quiet, and the woods had that particular stillness that hunters know means something changed. The birds stopped. The squirrels stopped. Everything just went flat and silent, like the forest itself was holding still. He said that silence lasted almost 20 minutes before the first bird finally called again, and that 20 minutes felt considerably longer sitting alone on that ridge than it would have anywhere else. That was when he found the first print. He measured it with a tape measure he kept in his pack for marking blood trails. 15.5 inches long, just over 7 inches across at the widest point of the ball of the foot. For context, an average adult male shoe in the United States runs somewhere around 11 to 12 inches. This print was, by any reasonable comparison, close to a third larger than a big man's foot. But size alone wasn't what stopped him. It was the depth. The mud along that creek bank was soft, but not soft enough that his own 190-pound frame sank in more than about half an inch when he stepped in the same spot to compare. The print he was looking at was pressed nearly 2 full inches down, and it showed a clear midfoot flex. The kind of pressure distribution you'd expect from a genuine flat-footed step. Not a rigid object pressed into the ground and pulled away. Danny Ray had grown up around livestock and game. He understood weight distribution instinctively, the way people who work outdoors often do without ever putting a name to it. And what he was looking at told him, in a language he trusted more than words, that whatever made that print carried a lot more weight than any person he'd ever stood next to. He photographed both prints on his phone before doing anything else, a decision that would matter more than he realized at the time. Because of what happened later, then he did something a lot of people in his position wouldn't have thought to do. He went back to his truck, drove the 20 minutes home, and got a bag of plaster of Paris that his wife used for a craft project 2 Christmases before. He came back within the hour. The first print was still there, undisturbed. He mixed the plaster in an old protein shaker bottle, poured it carefully into the deeper of the 2 impressions, and waited almost 45 minutes in the cold for it to set enough to lift without cracking. He said he spent most of that wait pacing a tight circle a few feet away, glancing at the tree line more than once, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had made that sound earlier hadn't necessarily gone far. When he finally worked it free from the mud, he was holding something that no photograph could fully capture, a 3-dimensional record of pressure and shape that, whatever it turned out to be, had been made by something real, standing in that spot, at some point in the hours before he arrived. He drove straight to a friend's house that afternoon, a man named Rick Tolliver, who ran a small taxidermy business out of his garage and had, in Danny Ray's words, seen about every animal foot God ever made. Rick looked at the cast for a long time without saying anything. Then he said the thing that would end up defining the entire story. "That's not bear. I don't care what anybody tells you. That's not bear." Rick's reasoning wasn't emotional, it was practical, the kind of observation you'd expect from someone who'd handled hundreds of black bear pelts and paws over the years. Black bear tracks, especially rear paw prints, can sometimes be mistaken for something humanoid by someone who doesn't know what they're looking at. The 5-toe pattern and heel shape create a passing resemblance. But Rick pointed to 2 things that didn't fit. First, there were no claw marks anywhere near the toes, something present in essentially every clear black bear print, especially in soft mud where claws typically drag or punch in ahead of the toe pads. Second, the big toe on this cast sat in line with the rest of the foot, not splayed to the side the way a bear's innermost digit typically presents. Rick also pointed out something less technical, more instinctive, the way the weight seemed to sit toward the outer edge of the foot. The kind of subtle asymmetry you see in a living gait, not in something staged. He'd handled enough fake or exaggerated animal casts over the years, made by hunters trying to win a bet or spook a friend, to know the difference between a print carved by hand and one pressed by something moving under its own weight. This one, he said, didn't feel carved, it felt walked. Word started to spread, the way it does in small communities, not through any deliberate announcement, but through the kind of conversation that happens at a gas station or a hardware store counter. Within a few days, a man named Curtis Whalen, who ran a small independent cryptid research page online and had investigated a handful of sighting reports across eastern Kentucky over the years, reached out to Danny Ray directly. Curtis wasn't a scientist, he'd say that himself, up front, every time. He'd spent close to a decade compiling local sighting reports, mostly second-hand accounts passed along by hunters and hikers who wanted their story documented but didn't want their names publicly attached to it. Most of what he collected amounted to little more than folklore, a shape glimpsed at dusk, a smell someone couldn't place, a sound in the distance. Physical evidence, in his years of doing this, had been almost non-existent. A cast this clear, from a source this credible, was something he said he'd been waiting for without ever really expecting to find. But he had something a lot of casual investigators didn't: a working relationship with a retired wildlife biologist willing to look at evidence off the record, without her name attached to anything public. Curtis arranged for photographs of the cast, along with detailed measurements, to be sent to her. Her response, according to Curtis, was cautious but notable. She wrote back that the depth-to-weight ratio did not correspond well with any species native to the region, and that the midfoot pressure pattern was, in her words, consistent with a plantigrade gait, meaning a foot that plants flat, heel and ball together, the way human feet do, and the way bare feet partially do, but unlike the more digitigrade gait of deer, canines, or most other large mammals in that forest. She stopped short of drawing any conclusion beyond that. She wouldn't put her name on a statement, wouldn't speculate publicly about what it meant, and made clear she wasn't endorsing any particular explanation. But she also, notably, never offered a clean, simple answer that closed the case. No official identification. No, this is obviously a known animal. Mystery solved. Just an acknowledgement that the physical characteristics were unusual enough to be worth documenting, and, according to Curtis, a passing comment that she'd want to examine the cast in person before saying anything further. A request that, as it turned out, would never be fulfilled. For about a week and a half, the cast sat in Danny Ray's garage on a shelf, wrapped in an old towel, while he figured out what to do with it. Curtis had asked to borrow it for a planned meetup with two other researchers from a regional cryptid investigation group. People with more equipment, calipers, a proper scale, UV lighting to check for any tool marks or signs the print had been faked. That meetup never happened. On a Thursday evening, Danny Ray came home from a double shift at the plant to find his garage door standing open about 8 inches, not fully open. Not the kind of thing a break-in alarm would necessarily catch. Just enough that anyone walking by might not think twice about it. His wife had been home most of the day but hadn't gone into the garage. Nothing else in the space had been touched. His tools were untouched. A deer rifle worth several $100s, sitting in an unlocked case less than 10 feet from where the cast had been sitting, was untouched. The cast was gone. Not knocked over. Not broken, just gone, towel and all, from a shelf in a locked residential garage in a quiet part of Laurel County. While the only item missing from the entire property was the single piece of physical evidence tied to an unexplained footprint in the woods. Danny Ray filed a report with the local sheriff's office. Mostly, he later said, so there'd be an official record that the cast had existed and had gone missing. Not because he expected law enforcement to treat it as a priority. He was right not to expect much. The report was filed, logged, and by every account, never actively investigated. No fingerprint work, no follow-up. In the eyes of the department, it was a minor property matter involving an item with no resale value and no clear suspect. One deputy reportedly told him, not unkindly, that there simply wasn't much to go on. No forced entry, no witnesses, and, from the department's standpoint, no way to prove the item had been stolen at all rather than misplaced, discarded, or damaged by Danny Ray himself. Curtis Whalen has his own theory, and he's careful to frame it as speculation rather than certainty. He points out that word of the cast, and the retired biologist's off-record assessment, had circulated somewhat more widely than Danny Ray initially realized, including, Curtis believes, to at least one person connected to a larger, more established cryptid research organization that had, in the past, been known to acquire physical evidence from independent finders, sometimes through purchase, occasionally through less transparent means, in order to keep it out of public circulation while they conducted their own private analysis. There's no proof of that. Curtis is the first to say so. No confession, no confirmed connection, nothing beyond a pattern he says he's seen before in this field. Evidence that generates enough interest to become valuable. and then quietly disappears before independent verification can happen. He says he's seen versions of this story more than once over the years. A promising photograph, a compelling recording, a piece of hair or tissue sent off for testing, and then silence. Or a sudden unwillingness from the original finder to keep talking. Or, as in this case, the evidence itself simply ceasing to exist. Others have simpler, more mundane theories. Maybe it was a random, opportunistic theft by someone who'd heard the story locally and wanted a strange souvenir. Small towns talk, and it's not hard to imagine a curious teenager or an overeager fan of the story deciding to take a shortcut to owning a piece of it. Maybe it was never as secure as Danny Ray remembered, and animals or weather did more damage than anyone accounted for, and what's left is just an exaggerated retelling of a mundane loss. Skeptics point out, reasonably, that a story built entirely around a missing piece of evidence is, by its very structure, unfalsifiable. There's no cast left to test, no way to independently confirm any of the measurements beyond Danny Ray's own numbers and Rick Tolliver's private assessment. It's a fair criticism, and one Curtis doesn't dismiss outright. He acknowledges that from a strict evidentiary standpoint, what remains is testimony, not proof, and testimony, however sincere, isn't the same as a cast sitting on a lab table under a biologist's microscope. But he also points out that this is, in his experience, exactly the pattern that makes this field so difficult to study rigorously in the first place. The moments when something concrete finally surfaces are disproportionately the moments when it also disappears, is dismissed, or is quietly absorbed by someone unwilling to let it be independently examined. What remains, in the end, are the photographs Danny Ray took that first morning, still on his phone, later backed up and shared with Curtis and a handful of researchers. Measurements taken by hand, by a man with no history of hoaxing and, by every account, from people who've known him for decades. Nothing to gain from making this story up. A private, off-record assessment from a credentialed biologist who stopped short of an explanation but never offered a simple one either. And a plaster cast that, for 11 days, sat on a garage shelf in Laurel County, Kentucky, as the only three-dimensional physical evidence connecting a strange sound in the woods to something that pressed itself twice into Soft Creek bank mud with a force no deer, no bear, and by Rick Tolliver's estimation, no known animal in that forest could account for. Danny Ray still hunts that ridge. He says he goes back to that same creek crossing every season, out of some mixture of habit and unfinished business he can't fully explain. Even to himself, he hasn't found another print since. He hasn't heard that same heavy, two-count rhythm moving through the brush again. Not once, in the years since. He says some mornings he catches himself standing at that same bend in the creek longer than he means to, just watching the mud, half expecting and half dreading the idea of finding something there again. But he still carries a bag of plaster in his pack, just in case. And somewhere, in a landfill, in someone's private collection, in the back of a research organization's storage unit that will never open its doors to independent verification, or simply crumbled apart from age and neglect in whatever place it ended up, the only physical proof of what happened on that ridge in Daniel Boone National Forest is still out there. Or it isn't, and that, more than the print itself, is the part of this story that nobody has ever been able to put to rest.